Mala, come. You have a new pup and you have your garden and you want the two to play well together. So how do you do it? Join me today as I show you how I've had success introducing dogs to the garden. This is Mala. This is my new dog. She's about a year old. She hasn't been trained very well at all, so kind of working with a blank slate. And I'm outside in the garden a lot. So I've had to focus on how to get Mala interested in gardening with me, but not running all over the beds and causing problems within the garden. And it's not as hard as you think. First off, I like to make the garden an inviting place. This is some place where we both go. It's calming and it's a place that I enjoy. Therefore, she can pick up on that and it becomes a place that she can enjoy too. Now, I'm not a professional dog trainer, but I have had dogs for most of the last 25 years, the same time that I've had gardens, and we've all got along great together with no major problems. A few mistakes here and there, but that's going to happen. I do know that when it comes to training the dogs, consistency is important, and setting the limitations and the boundaries are also very important. You can't blame the dog if you didn't take the time to identify the good spaces from the bad spaces. And that's an important step. So from the very first day that I got Mala, we came out to the garden and I started defining for her what the limitations of the garden was. The difference between the pathways and the beds. And I spent a lot of time just walking on the pathways, in and out, all around the beds, to get her the basic idea that this is where we walk. I also enlisted the help of my granddaughters to do the same thing. They walked in and out of the beds with Mala wanting to follow along. This really helped to reinforce the lesson of where she could walk and where she couldn't. Now, most of my vegetable garden is raised beds, and I said in an earlier video that that's one of the benefits of a raised bed. It helps keep animals out of your plants because they learn to go in the spaces around the bed. But that doesn't happen all the time, especially from the beginning. And I did have that issue with Mala exploring some of the space in the bed. But that was easy to correct, to just identify for her that she needed to get out of a bed. Off. It becomes a little more difficult to define the good space from the bad space when you're growing in an in-ground bed, because even for people, it's often difficult to figure out where the path ends and the garden bed begins. But from the very beginning, with a new dog, you have to keep an eye on them at all times. And if they begin to venture into an area that's off limits, you need to give corrective action. Mala, get out of there. Go on. Calm, but consistent, so that they recognize the good space from the bad space. Come here, Mala. And so in time, she's learned that she doesn't walk straight across the plants, but instead walks around the plants, still on the pathways. Now, this didn't happen immediately, but it just took a few minutes of training to define for her what space is appropriate to walk and which space isn't. Now, this isn't foolproof, and because I'm not a professional dog trainer, and we do take a much more relaxed attitude about the garden in general, I have had some issues in the past, particularly with the in-ground beds. My beloved gardening companion Shaka was great at walking around the beds on the pathways. But as a chocolate lab, she loved squirrels. She loved chasing the squirrels. And if there was a squirrel on the other side of the garden, she would take the direct path to that squirrel, which often was right over the garden beds, and I lost some plants as a result of it. So in that case, I could have spent a lot of time training her to ignore the squirrels, but instead I just built a low fence about 3 foot high to separate the main yard from the garden area. And that achieved the same results as the raised beds. It helped clearly define the go space from the stop space. And we would walk through the gates and she would help out in the garden, but if the squirrels were out, I would just close the gates, and that was enough to keep her from running across the beds. Most dogs can figure out to jump a fence if they really want to. But with that guidance, with that control, with that setting of the boundaries, she never jumped the fence. She always waited until I opened a gate and allowed her into the garden. And as your dog is roaming, they're probably going to tire out before you do. And especially if you have a black dog like Mala, they're going to get overheated in the sun. And I'm out here in the sun a lot. So she's learned to find a nice shady spot to cool down. She can still keep an eye on me. She can still spend time in the garden. She's still nearby, but she's cooling off in the shade and letting me do all of the hot work in the sun. And I think that is one of the reasons she's jumped into some of the beds, is because it offers nice shade with the tall plants. Instead, I just redirect her to where the tall plants are shading a pathway. And this is where she likes to spend her time, in addition to a lot of other areas in the garden. And she's been doing this since I've had her. I've only had her for a little more than a week and a half. A recent video I shot has her in frame, even though you can't see her, because she's lying down underneath the tomato plants in the cool shade. And my yellow lab, Lily, does the same thing. She likes to hang out behind this bed because the sun comes from that direction and there's usually some shade. And not sure if you could see it, but Mala has just gone to the same spot. So right behind me in this pathway is the favorite spot for both of my dogs. This is another favorite spot of Mala's, and so my plan is to actually make this a nice little grassy area so she can just hang out and relax in some comfort. I don't have a lawn in my space, but I'm willing to put a little grassy area in just to keep her happy. And it's important to understand that a lot of our normal gardening activities are completely new to dogs. Mala was scared by the water wand in the beginning, but now I've trained her to actually take a drink from the water when it's hot outside. If you can, I think it's a good idea to try to introduce the garden to your new dog with the help of an old dog. And so Lily doesn't join me as much anymore as she ages and gets hot in the sun pretty quickly. But she's been a big help in just walking around the yard and the garden with Mala and helping to clearly identify the space. But the garden space is different than play space. So when they play together, when they wrestle, that's not in the garden. That's in a different spot that's designated for that activity. And it's important to keep that separated. So if you see the dogs getting too excited in the garden space, remove them from the garden space and put them in an area that's okay to get some of that energy out and play. A big concern of gardeners with dogs is digging. And this is some of Mala's handiwork, where she's been digging for some of the gophers that I have in this area. Now that's not a bad thing, because One of the reasons I got her is to help deal with the gophers. But it comes back to consistency and boundaries. And in this space, it's okay for her to dig. I let her do it, and I'll actually praise her when she finds a gopher hole. But if I see any indication of her starting to dig in one of the other beds, it's an immediate corrective action. Again, the good space is the garden. She's not allowed to misbehave. In the rest of the landscape, it's all hers, and she can patrol and help keep some of those pests away. I love my dogs, and I love my garden, and I really like gardening with my dogs. With a little bit of effort, it can really be an enjoyable experience for both of us. And you too. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.